Good morning. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some underwater plants and animals. And while we're at it, we're going to look at a few examples of plants and animals as well. And maybe learn a thing or two in the process. So whenever I say underwater plants and animals, what comes to mind? For me, what comes to mind are things like fish and seaweed, um, uh, which is exactly right. There's a lot of fish, a lot of different kinds of fish. Actually, there's more kinds of fish than there are any other kind of large animal. Um, so underwater plants, they're usually very spongy, slimy. They kind of like seaweed. They float around. And whereas land plants tend to be a little bit more rigid and a little bit more upright. Think like trees, right? Trees, they're not slimy and spongy. They tend to be very tall and upright. And even things like flowers and grass are all uh, very upright facing. Whereas seaweed and other underwater plants, they attach themselves to things like rocks and they grow and look a lot different than land plants. They tend to grow either really tall and stick up out of the water, or they stick close to the surface of the water to get that sunlight that they need. Um, and get everything else that they need as well. So just like land plants need soil, air, light, some source of nutrients like soil. Underwater plants need all of that as well. Underwater plants need everything that land plants need. They just kind of go about it a slightly different way. So for their sunlight, they get their sunlight from the same place. They get it from the sun. But have you ever been underwater and looked up? Maybe you have goggles on, or maybe it's fresh water, and you can just look up and you can see the sun, but it doesn't seem quite as bright as if you're on land. That's true. It's not as bright. So these underwater plants, they need to figure out ways to collect the sunlight. So some of them get really tall and stretch up and poke up out of the water, whereas other ones, uh, they just get broader and wider so that they can collect more sunlight. Um, they get better and better at turning sunlight into energy and food. Um, Now, for air, so plants absorb a thing called carbon dioxide. It's what you breathe out whenever you breathe out. So breathe in, you're getting all that oxygen, and then whenever you breathe out, you're sending out carbon dioxide. Um, and plants actually use carbon dioxide. They take that carbon dioxide and they use that sunlight and they make energy. And they turn that energy, they use that energy to live, and then they turn all of the rest of it, they just give out oxygen. So just like you breathe in oxygen and then breathe out carbon dioxide, they breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. Now, land plants do this, and underwater plants do this as well. Um, Underwater plants get their carbon dioxide from the water around them. They just absorb it right out of there. Um, they get their water in pretty much the same way land plants do. Land plants get their water from roots, and they also absorb some water just from their leaves and whatnot. Underwater plants do exactly the same, but they've got water in abundance. So they've got water all around them, so they don't have to worry about it as much. Um, so yeah, those are all the things that underwater plants, they get all of their stuff the same way that land plants do. Um, so now let's talk about some underwater animals a little bit. So how are underwater animals different from land animals? Well, underwater animals have a few different adaptations or special abilities that make them really well suited to living under the water. Whenever I talk about underwater animals, I'm talking about animals that live under the water. They might spend all of their time or most of their time under the water. You know, sometimes they can come up onto land depending on the animal. I'm actually going to show you a few animals today that spend almost all their time under the water, but do occasionally come up onto land. Um, so we're going to talk about the five senses and how they relate to underwater animals. So let's start counting the five senses here. We've got sight. So we're going to talk about how underwater animals see and how it's different from how you and I see. We're going to talk about taste. So how is taste different for underwater animals? You know, we use our tongues. We chew up some food, some delicious food. Like I had pancakes this morning. They were very delicious. But how would an underwater animal taste? And how is it different from how we do? How they smell. So how underwater animals can use their sense of smell and how it's different. How they feel things, so how they can sense different stuff around them. Like we use our whole bodies to feel things. We use our hands, our feet. We can even feel if there's a strong breeze, we can feel it on our faces. And we're going to talk about how they hear. So how is their hearing differently? We're also going to talk about how they breathe, because we breathe air, but what do underwater animals breathe? Do they also breathe air? Do they breathe the water? We're going to find out. So I am going to share with you a video or a few really short videos that I took of our aquarium this morning. And as soon as I get to it here we go. So here we are. All right. So I've got, I put them all on some slideshows. There's some really short videos on here that will show us a few different creatures. So the first video that I took here is of our blue hole exhibit. It is a freshwater exhibit. So it's right off of, it's what it would look like if we were to take a video camera and drop it into a spring on the Flint River, which is right next door to our aquarium. And we're just going to watch it real quick here. There's some sound. Some kids that were also excited to see the animals just like you guys were. So those are just a few of the fish. Here, I'll show it again. So let's take a look at how these fish look and how they move. So fish are the first example of an underwater organism that I want to look at. Oh, hold on. We're going to go back to the fish. We're going to look at that one next. So let's talk about fish for a minute. So we all know what a fish looks like. A fish is a very, very common underwater animal. Let's talk about a couple of the things that make a fish a fish. We look at them and we see that they've got fins on their back. They've got a big back tail fin there, and then they've also got, here, let's see if I can get one from the side here. Oh yeah, we've got a couple great examples of some fish here now. We've got some fish. They've got these fins on the side here. They've got a big tail fin. They've got a dorsal fin on their back. And they've got all of these different parts that make them very, very well adapted, very well suited to living under the water. So fish, they swim around under the water, and they're really, 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 really good at it. Um, they've got these two fins on the side that help them maneuver and steer. They've got their big back fin, which helps them move forward and pushes them forward like a paddle. Um, and they've also got a couple other senses that make them really well suited to the water. So we're going to talk about our five senses again. Um, so let's talk first about their sight. So we have really good eyesight. We can see really, really well, pretty far. And a lot of other animals that live on land have excellent eyesight. Fish usually don't have very good eyesight. They can usually see pretty well at close range, but once you get a little bit further, it's a lot harder to see. That's because if you've ever looked at a river before, it tends to be fairly murky looking. Um, it's harder to see in murky water, and so they rely on a couple other senses instead of sight. One of those senses is smell. Fish actually have really, really good senses of smell. So I want you to imagine you're a fish, right? Picture yourself as a beautiful, beautiful fish. You've got your eyes here, you've got your fins on the side, you've got your big tail fins swishing around. You have a nose, just like we have a nose. You've got these two little nostrils on the top of just above your mouth, and the water from the stream is constantly flowing and hitting your face. And as that water hits your face, some of that water goes up your nose. But it's okay because you're special. That's actually how you smell. You can smell the little scent particles in the water as they flow through your nose. Um, and you can pick up what's in front of you in the water, what's downstream, maybe a delicious juicy worm or bug, or possibly a larger fish that might eat you if you get too close. So you've got to be careful. They really, really rely on their sense of smell. Uh, Another thing that fish rely on very heavily is their sense of touch. So, what do we use to touch? We use our hands, we use our feet, we use our whole bodies, right? We can feel wind and waves of air hitting us. We can feel things with our fingers. We've got all sorts of ways to feel things. So, fish also have a pretty good sense of touch. Uh, their whole bodies are designed for it. They actually have what's called a lateral line. You can see it pretty clearly in the sturgeon up in the corner. There's this line that runs right across the length of fish that allows them to feel whenever water moves around them in a slightly different way. So if picture yourself as that fish again, swimming upstream, you can feel the current flowing by you, and suddenly you feel a shift of the current in front of you. Uh-oh, that means you better shift as well, right? You can feel it very clearly across your whole body as you do it. Um, let's talk about hearing, since that kind of goes along with feeling, believe it or not. So how do you hear? I want you to point to where you hear from, right? It's right here. It's your ears. You hear with your ears. Fish also have ears, but can anybody point them out? Kind of hard. They're on the inside of their bodies. You're not going to be able to see them. They're just on the inside, right behind their heads. They have little ear bones just inside of their ear. They're called ear stones, and it helps them feel vibrations. It's almost like a drum. Like whenever you hit a drum, the drum vibrates. Same kind of deal with their ears. They can, if a sound echoes through the water, they will be able to hear it because it'll vibrate their head. And so they can hear things actually really well. And their ears also help them with balance. Your ears also help you with balance. You have a little bit of liquid in your ear, and it helps you sort of keep track of which way is up and which way is down. Their ears also help them keep balance. And that lateral line that I talked about before, like this big old sturgeon has up here in the top, um, it also helps them keep their balance because they use their ears and their bodies and even their nose to determine where they are related to everything around them. Excuse me. And they can tell exactly where they are in relation to everything else. Now, there's one more sense that we haven't talked about yet, and it's taste. And it's my favorite sense to talk about with fish, because fish don't just taste with their mouths. Fish also taste with their fins. So I want you to stick out your tongue. Right here on your tongue is where your taste buds are, right? Right here on your tongue is where your taste buds are. Fish have taste buds on their tongue as well. They can actually tell if something's sweet or salty or sour, just like you can. But they also have taste buds on their fins, which is really wild. So the reason why they have taste buds on their fins as well is I want you to imagine you're that fish one more time for me. You're swimming up the stream. You're smelling something in the water, but you're not quite sure what it is yet. You can feel the vibrations ahead of you, and you can suddenly taste on your fins the smell of a delicious, delicious, juicy worm. You can taste it now, and you can smell it. And all of these are telling you there's a worm in front of you. There's a delicious, delicious bug of some sort in front of you that you want to eat. Because bugs are delicious if you're, say, a trout. And so all of these things combine to tell you that it's good to go, or there's something not quite right about it and you don't want to eat it. So they can taste with their fins just as well as with their with their mouths, and you use your nose a little bit for taste too, because smell and taste kind of go together, right? So that's it for fish specifically, but there aren't just fish in the water. There's a lot of different kinds of critters that live in the water. We're going to talk about one more creature here that we have at our aquarium. We actually only just recently got this little guy. It is an octopus. So this octopus didn't really want to do a lot for me whenever I was videotaping it, but I think it's a good video to watch nonetheless. You don't just have fish in the water, you have other creatures too, such as the octopus. An octopus is what's called a cephalopod, which is a really big fun word. Cephalopod is just what we call things like octopus and squids and other things that have wriggly little tentacles and arms. So an octopus is another kind of creature that lives under the water. They live under the water their whole lives, and they use their 8, that's why they're called octopuses. Octo means 8. They have 8 arms covered in tentacles that they use to grab hold of things. And if you actually see the video here, they've got this real fun little piece of enrichment, this toy that they've got, because octopus are really smart. And so they need, just like you guys, you probably need a lot of toys to keep yourselves occupied, right? These octopus need toys and other things to keep themselves occupied, to have a good time, to have fun. And so this octopus is hanging out in this shell, eating things that go by and playing around with its toys. So the reason why I want to talk about this octopus here, it gets its food from digging around in the water. It eats other creatures. It eats small fish, maybe bugs whenever it's this small, other things like that. Maybe small crabs, shrimp. But the thing that I thought was cool about this video of the octopus here is, if you see right underneath its eye, you can see it breathing, which is really cool. So octopus have gills, just like fish do. Fish have gills and octopus have gills. Um, and they use these gills to breathe. So what happens is for fish, water flows past their gills, which are right here on their neck. They've got them right here, and they flow past, and there's oxygen all through the water just mixed in. And these fish, their gills will grab the oxygen, and it'll go through their body, just like how whenever you breathe, you're collecting oxygen. Fish do the same thing, but they let the water run past them to collect their oxygen. And actually, their gills look a lot like this. And if you wave your hand around in the air, you can feel all that wind hitting your hand, right? Well, their gills work in pretty much the same way. They let this water hit their hands, hit their gills, I mean, and it flows past them and creates and they collect all that oxygen from it. Now, this octopus is standing still, and the water's probably not moving very fast around it. So what it's doing, if you were able to see, is it is pushing water into its head, which is where its gills are, and it's letting that water run past its gills, and then it's pushing it back out again. And we can watch it one more time here. You can see it. It's pushing water into its head, past its gills, and then pumping it right back out again. Just like how whenever you breathe, you're pushing all of that air into your lungs, and then you're releasing it all whenever you're letting go. It works exactly the same way, just underwater. So we've talked about some animals that live under the water now. Let's talk about some animals that live under the water, but don't necessarily spend all of their time under the water. So we are going to talk about one of my favorite critters. We're going to talk about a turtle next. Now, you'll have to forgive the glare because of the way that the light was coming in. You can sort of see my reflection a bit. But this video does a great job demonstrating turtles here. So whenever you think of a turtle, you might think, oh, really slow, crawls around on land. But that's not exactly true. Turtles, for the most part, tend to be aquatic animals. They get into the water and they swim around, and we're going to talk about a couple of the things that make them excellent swimmers. But before we do, I want to show you how they swim around. As you can see, this turtle's having the time of its life right now, swimming around under the water. And it's actually a really, really excellent swimmer. You might be able to tell just from looking at it that it's a great swimmer. What do you think are some of the things that make turtles great for living under the water? There are a few things, and if you saw in that video, a couple of them might give you some clues, but in order to talk about them a little bit more, I want to have a little bit more of a hands-on view of these adaptations. So if you give me just one moment, I'm going to go grab our first creature today. So our first critter today is a map turtle, and it's a little bit shy. This turtle is a little bit shy today, but it might come out in just a moment. Map turtles are really, really common river turtles. They can be found all the way up in Canada and all the way down to the coast. And they're called map turtles, and it's kind of hard to see, but they're called map turtles because if you look, you see all of those fancy lines all over it. Well, they reminded whoever named them of a map, which is why they're called map turtles. They're also sometimes called sawbacks, and you might be able to see it pretty well here. They've got these little ridges on their backs, and it kind of looks like a saw blade, which is why they're called sawbacks. Now, you think of turtles and you think, oh, they're kind of slow. But in reality, that's not really true. They're just really, really well suited towards the water. and they've got a couple adaptations that make them pretty great for the water. One of them is their legs. They've got these very specialized legs that are covered in webs. Here, let's see. I'll just keep holding it here. They've got these legs that they've got these webbed feet that make it really great for pushing all of that water behind them and propelling them forward. Their front claws, their front legs tend to have these claws that help them for digging in the dirt if they need to hide from predators. Because if you look at this turtle, if you were to put this turtle in a stream and look down, it would probably look just like the rest of the rocks that are around. And that's because they are really, really well adapted to looking like rocks. They've got what's called camouflage, which makes them look like a rock. And so if they really need to hide, what they generally do is, let's say you're a turtle and it's a really warm day and you're just sitting on a log enjoying the sunlight, and then suddenly you see a shadow overhead. It's a hawk. Uh-oh, better go hide, right? So you dive into the water, you use your big paddly feet to push yourself downwards. You get to the bottom of the lake or pond or stream, and you dig a little bit, and you nestle yourself in, and the hawk's never going to be able to find you because you look like a rock. So I am going to set this this turtle aside, and we're going to take a look at one more creature, and I'm very excited to show it off to you. It's a little bit bigger than a map turtle, and it is also very well suited to living underwater, just like this map turtle. It doesn't spend all its time under the water. The map turtle will come up and hang out on, say, a log or just onto the shore to enjoy that sunlight, get those rays. But it will spend most of its time in the water. It eats a lot of plants and animals in the water. And it will come up for air pretty regularly, but it spends almost all of its time under the water. The next animal that I'm bringing up also spends almost all of its time under the water. So give me 1 second and I will have this animal up as well. Here. So let me know. Can we see this all right? Yeah, we can see this all right. You might even be able to hear him right now. He's being real ornery. This is Stubbs, an American alligator. So Stubbs it's called that because he's got one stubby little leg. Stubbs is an American alligator. They usually get a lot bigger than this. This is a pretty young American alligator. Here, let me just see if I can adjust the camera a little bit so that you can see Stubbs a little bit better. So Stubbs here, he's an American alligator. They are found throughout the American South. They live in rivers and streams and other freshwater areas. So they don't really go out into the ocean where there's salt water. Sometimes they can be found pretty close to the coast. And Stubbs here has a lot of things that make him really, really good for living under the water. A couple of them you might be able to notice. First of all, you see this big tail? This big tail acts a lot like a fish's tail. It acts kind of like a rudder. It helps them steer, helps them move. They can also use it. They kind of, whenever they're under the water, they like to sit near the surface and they'll use their tail to kind of prop themselves up a little bit in the water. But they also use it to help push themselves forward as they're swimming. There's also a couple other adaptations that make stubs excellent for living under the water. If you notice, Stubbs is really, really dark on the top, as you can see, and kind of light on the underside, as you can see. Um, and that's because if you are standing above a stream and you're looking down, what color is the stream going to be? It's going to be pretty dark, right? So Stubbs is trying to blend in, trying to look like nothing at all, uh, so that if something like, say, something that it would want to eat, like a small critter, comes up to the edge of the water, it can lunge out and grab it real quick without it ever noticing. Or if, say, because Stubbs is kind of small, if some larger creature uh, sees uh, Stubbs, it's going to try to eat it. So Stubbs wants to stay hidden. It's fairly light. Stubbs is fairly light underneath, for almost the exact same reasons. If you have you guys ever been under the water and looked up, it's pretty bright. So having a light coloration underneath also helps with camouflage. Now Stubbs has a couple other things that make him really, really good for living under the water. Um, his eyes sit on the very top of its head. That's because Stubbs has great vision, wants to be able to see everything that's going on, generally hangs out near the edge of the water, waiting for something to get close to the water, and uh, really needs to tell whenever something is coming. So he'll sit just under the water, floating around, waiting, waiting, waiting. And then whenever he sees something, he'll duck a little bit underneath, swim real close, pop his head up again just to see, and then we'll go for it if it looks like a good meal. His nostrils are also right there on the top of his snout there. Um, and they are on the top of his head so that whenever he's lurking in the water, he can see pretty clearly. He can see pretty clearly what is happening. And sorry, I got a little distracted there. His eyes are on the top of his head so that he can see pretty clearly. His nostrils are on the top of his head so that he can continue to breathe while he's hanging out underwater, because Stubbs does not have gills. He has lungs, just like you and me. But he lives under the water for a lot of his life. So he needs some way to be able to breathe while hanging out underwater. And so he does that through his nose. He breathes through his nose out of the top. Now, whenever Stubbs gets a little bit bigger, he's going to be an absolutely massive, very large creature that we know as an adult alligator. And I'm going to show you what an adult alligator looks like here in just a moment. I just got to put Stubbs back. So an adult alligator is obviously a lot bigger than that. And I actually have an alligator skull to show just how big. You saw how small Stubbs's head was. Whenever Stubbs is going to become full grown, he's going to have a lot bigger of a head, a whole lot bigger. So let's get some conclusions here. We talked about underwater plants and how they're very similar to land plants. They get their stuff in more or less the same way. They just have to do it a slightly different way. If you remember, underwater plants, they need light just like land plants do. And so that's why they tend to grow very tall and reach near the surface, or live slightly out of the water in some cases, like lily pads and stuff like that. They'll branch out on the top of the water. They tend to be kind of spongy and slimy and a little bit more wobbly than their land cousins, because, well, they don't need to be as rigid and tall and stand straight up. We talked about underwater animals and how they use their five senses underwater. We specifically looked at fish, how they see they can see really close up, but not too far away because they don't really need to, right? Because the water tends to be somewhat murky and you can't see very far in underwater anyways. They have specialized taste buds on their mouth and on their gills. They can touch things. They use what's called a lateral line down their body to sense vibrations in the water. Um, they hear using this sort of drum-like organ on the sides of their heads. It's inside of their head though, so it's not like us where we can hear on the outside. They feel the vibrations hitting their body, and that's how they hear. Um, they breathe using these gills. They let water run past their gills. Um, and we also looked at a few creatures that have lungs and live off out of the water sometimes, but spend most of their time in the water. We looked at our map turtle and discussed how turtles are really well suited to moving around in the water. And we looked at an alligator and saw how alligators are really, really well suited to spending most of their time under the water, using their noses to breathe by sticking it just out of the water, using their eyes to see any creatures that are coming and going, and their awesome camouflage, which they use to make themselves basically invisible under the water. So that's all I had to talk about today. Does anybody have any questions? That would be your cue.
Our students don't have any questions, but we
Okay,
appreciate you delivering on underwater plants and animals. You did a really awesome job.
thanks. Thank you. I am happy to do it. This was a pretty fun experience. I also always love handling an alligator. Well, if there are no questions, thank you very much for coming. And I really had a lot of fun with you guys. Bye.